Hi, Diane.
Hey, Derek.
So you strike me as someone who follows the news and current events.
I do, probably more than I should for my mental health, actually.
Well, there's certainly a lot going on in the news these days, from war in Europe and the Middle East to political division and polarization all over the world.
Are we turning this into a political podcast?
No, we're not. But we do have an exciting guest on the podcast today. She's a political science professor here at McGill, whose work specializes in issues around freedom, global justice, human rights, and polarization.
That sounds super fascinating, and who knows, maybe it'll actually help me with my scrolling and news addiction. So let's cue up the podcast.
Great, let's do that. Welcome to this edition of the Mark My Words podcast. My name is Derek Kassoff, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Catherine Liu, Professor of Political Science, Director of McGill's Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds, and coordinator of the Research Group on Global Justice. Catherine, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, listen, we have lots of weighty issues to unpack over the course of the episode. But maybe first, you could tell us a little bit more about your background and how you wound up pursuing this particular field of study. Did it come from any particular passion or lived experience?
Well, I think my passion for political philosophy came from the very first year that I went to university at UBC as an undergrad, where I was exposed to political philosophers like Plato, Marx, and Mill. And they perplexed me because they had very interesting but complicated arguments about, for example, what it means to live the good life, what is justice, what is injustice, what is a free person, and what is freedom, what is a free society. So I was very much captured by those questions, and probably partly from personal experience in the sense that I'm an immigrant and we came from China, and I experienced, I think, from my family, a disconnect between the free society that I lived in and the more authoritarian nature of my parents, but also their lack of political agency due to problems that they faced in China during the Cultural Revolution. So I was very interested in the importance of politics to our personal as well as public lives.
Wow, very interesting. So tell me a bit about let me get this right, the Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. Now, it's a long name, even by McGill standards, and it feels like there's a lot of scholarly responsibility attached to it, especially given the current state of affairs in our world today. So can you tell me what sorts of professors and scholars are affiliated with the center, and what are some of the big questions that you and they are wrestling with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a very long name. And so the first thing is that the center houses actually 6 research groups. Broadly, the research agenda of these groups is to facilitate the study of social political orders across time and globally in a global context, focusing on problems of freedom, of order, of power, and of normative and historical transformation. So just to give a brief overview, my group on global justice looks at philosophical normative questions about the historical and political development of global, transnational, international institutions, structures, and practices. My colleague Jacob Levy, who actually is the founding director of the Lin Center and the coordinator of the group on constitutional studies, studies constitutionalism, understood as the normative analysis of politics, overlapping with empirical work done in political science on things like constitutional rules, federalism, and also their jurisprudential features. We also have historians involved in the Lin Center who do work on ancient China and ancient Greece, as well as Rome, Byzantium, and the wider Mediterranean world, and they constitute the research group on global pasts. We also have historians of modern history who are interested in modern political and global modernities and transformations. And we also have faculty from architecture who are looking at the problems of the built environment, the design of buildings, cities, and territories, and the importance of the built environment for freedom, public life, and democracy. And that's the research group on democracy, space, and technology.
Wow.
And we also have a relatively new research group on human nature and values in the digital age, which looks at questions about the transformation of human life and problems by digital technologies. Hopefully I haven't missed one, but yes, but as you can see, it's a very eclectic group of research that involves scholars from many faculties, including arts and law and architecture and even medicine.
Right. And now I think we understand why the center needs such a long name.
Yes, exactly.
So you mentioned that your group focuses on issues of global justice and in that sphere. So I'm wondering how would you define concepts like freedom, world order, and global justice in today's geopolitical climate that is so polarized and divisive? Sort of what frameworks or principles, either from ancient times or from more modern philosophies, ought to guide our understanding of justice and cooperation between people, between nations?
Well, I could give a very long. These are questions for a lifetime, I think, and it's true. We have studied these questions, for as long as human beings have had ordered societies. I think what scholars in the center hope is to advance these debates in a historically contextualized way, where we aim for things like conceptual clarity. So when often we're arguing, it's not clear we're arguing about the same thing. So one thing that I think political philosophers try to do is to try to clarify exactly what is your meaning of freedom, so that we can see that we're actually arguing about the same thing. For example, historically and conceptually, we can say freedom could mean the absence of constraint. That's one way to think about what freedom is. Other ways might be that we think about freedom as independence, freedom from arbitrary power, right? And others might think about freedom as meaning something like self-mastery or self-realization. So these conceptions of freedom have been in the history of at least Western political thought, and we can try in trying to spell out more clearly which kind or what form or conception of freedom we're talking about. We can use that perhaps as a basis, at least to clarify what we're arguing about. I think you're right, though, that in this geopolitical climate, what are academics contributing to these debates? And I guess I would say that there's a big difference between what happens in political debates, where people have certain political positions and, in a way, want to bring down those opponents of their view so that they can, win, right? So politics is about winning, whether it's your side or my side. If I'm trying to make my side win, I need to bring your side down in order to win an argument. But I think in genuine academic debate and philosophical debate, actually what we are interested in is trying to understand something more clearly, and not necessarily to be taking a side on a particular political issue. And so there, if we're interested in how best to think about freedom, then it's not about me winning or you winning. It's about how well your argument of freedom, how convincing it is to me. And for me to think about that, I have to then try to charitably think of what is the strongest way I could put a conception of freedom that you're forwarding, and then to try to think about whether there are any weaknesses to it. And if I can't find any, then there's no good reason for me not to agree with you on that. So I think the nature of academic philosophical debate is quite different from that in which people are politically, interested in winning rather than perhaps understanding or finding something that is commonly valuable to everyone, including something like truth about something.
Right. So you mentioned the role that academics play in these debates and their contributions. Where does one draw the line, though, between academic analysis and advocacy? And can one exist without the other?
Yeah, so I think so. The Lynn Center actually is very clear about this in our mission that we're mainly interested in academic research. Of course, many of our members also have political positions and take political views, but that's not what the center as a whole is about. We're not like a public policy school. We're not also advocating for certain political positions. What we would like is to be able to freely debate whatever political issues arise, but from the point of view of a history of intellectual work, debate, traditions that help us to address those issues. And in that sense, academic debate has to be much freer, I think, than perhaps what might be politic, for example, in our current circumstances.
Right. So, if you don't mind, maybe I'll just get a little bit more granular with the conversation. I know in your case, you've spent most of your academic career thinking and writing about issues related to colonialism and longstanding structural inequities. So, using that as your lens, what would you say are the ethical responsibilities of wealthier nations in addressing some of these global injustices? Should this be done through reparations, through foreign aid programs that we're familiar with, or policy reform? Is there any model that you found that works best?
Well, that's a great question. This question of what is the responsibility of wealthier nations in addressing global injustices. One thing that I've tried to do in my work is to try to orient the way we think about such questions. Because, there are people who would resist this kind of question. They would say, well, colonialism is over. So why do we need to even think about any kind of obligation? If there are obligations, they would say it has to do with basically perhaps need, right, or human rights. So they might say, look, regardless of the history of world politics, if there are people now who suffer from insufficiency or deep global poverty, then yes, wealthier nations have an obligation. And they would favor things like foreign aid, perhaps some policy reform as well. I think the idea of reparations, though, is involved in thinking that actually there is a kind of injustice that needs to be rectified. And so I try to intervene in these debates to say that actually, colonialism, we should think about colonialism as a kind of structural injustice of international order. It isn't something that just ended when formal colonialism ended. Rather, it is a structural process in which some groups were dominated by others, exploited, marginalized, and also prevented from participating as full and equal members in the constitution of the global society. And if we think about it that way, then reparations could have a role in trying to correct the structural injustice so that we have a more egalitarian world order. But it isn't reparations necessarily for like a historic wrong. And so I question whether these are the only options. In fact, I argue that the most important things in response to a colonial international order, which we still see being reproduced in many practices and structures, is actually decolonization, as well as decentering, as well as disalienation. So the idea that getting rid of mentalities that there is a hierarchy, for example, whether racial or colonial, and also decentering the way we think about like who is most important, or should we look at things from this point of view or always from a certain point of view, and of course decolonization, meaning that we also have to think about how many of our structures and processes continue to be colonial, not only in origin, but in sort of how they produce the outcomes of international cooperation.
So as we walk through or talk through these topics around, the global order and freedom and human rights, I can't help but not think about the United Nations. That's a body that's always fascinated me since I was a kid, to be honest. And I know that the UN was created out of the embers of World War II. Specifically, was intended to build cooperation among nations and try to bring down the threat of future conflict. So I'm curious, from your perspective, from your framework, has the UN proven to be an effective body when it comes to maintaining global order, or do we need to rethink our system of international governance? Or even yet, throw another curveball at you, is the idea of international governance even feasible in a world with so many nations and competing interests?
Yes, well, those are all very topical and difficult questions to answer. We certainly do see a return of geopolitics, and I think why it's surprising to us. I think is because we've been in the grip of the narrative of the post-Cold War sort of euphoria for so long, at least we in the West. The idea that 30 years ago, the end of this ideological conflict meant that there would be global harmony and increased international cooperation. The fact is that very soon after the end of the ideological Cold War, at least between the West and the Eastern blocs, and then the dissolution and collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, very soon after that, we did witness genocide in 1994 in Rwanda. We did witness the unauthorized uses of force by great powers, including the United States. We did witness civil war and, again, international interventions that continued civil wars, such as in Syria. So we saw the invasion of Iraq without UN Security Council authorization. So we saw many ways in which the international order was already being broken, especially by the great powers. So I think in that sense, looking back, we can see how we got here, right? Which is really a collapse of, I think, not just the framework, but the powers that had at least asserted a kind of idea of what the United Nations was supposed to achieve.
Right. But in some ways, the Cold War, having these two ideological opposite great powers, in a sense, perhaps balanced each other out, right?
I mean, so you could see it that way as a kind of balance. And I think what's most fascinating to me is the way that this balance led to a kind of identity formation on this two different sides, right? So when you think about the West, for example, in the United States, there's very much this idea that, well, we are not like the Soviet Union, and so therefore we don't torture people, and we are for human rights, political civil rights especially, and so we don't torture people. Of course, when you look at what happened after September 11th, in fact, the end of the Cold War, the loosening of this identity formation meant that the United States went very quickly to the idea that torture could be permissible. For example, when you're fighting a global war on terror and people are out to, bomb your buildings, right? So you saw a collapse of these basic human rights protections. And I think partly it's attributable to the collapse of this kind of ideological rivalry, which led to sort of these self-definitions. I think, unfortunately, another aspect that was negative about the end of the Cold War is that because of the way the Soviet Union collapsed due to its own basically economic implosion, it basically made it very difficult to argue that social economic rights were part of human rights. That is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the West, in fact, wasn't very good at institutionalizing protections for that. And the Soviet Union was supposed to be symbolically, at least, the champion for that. But because of their own problems and their collapse, these rights then didn't also get as much, I think, play as they perhaps should have.
Right. Oh, fascinating. So I just want, before we wrap up the conversation, I'd like to move from the sort of community of nations to the community of individuals, and think a little for a moment about the polarizing effect that we've seen develop, between, I guess we'll call it right and the left, I suppose, in the United States, of course, here in Canada, elsewhere around the world, even on our campuses, we're seeing this play out almost daily. I'm wondering, how much of a factor do you think social media, their algorithms, are playing in this political divisiveness? And is this something that we as a society can ever overcome?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not very much on social media. Like many people, I started being on it, but I very quickly realized that it's a very superficial form of communication. It also allows for a kind of what do you call it? A virtual kind of image. So what I noticed is that people often have virtual images, right, which are quite different from their actual personality or even personhood. And I think that it's important for people to argue with each other in person over coffee or tea,
Right.
rather than over the internet. You know, there's always somebody wrong on the internet, but it's also not real life. You know, and I think when people see each other and each other's humanity, the fact that they are a member of your community, the fact that they may be a teacher, a partner, you know, a worker, these all matter to I think how we come to view our differences, but also in the context of the fact that we have a shared fate, which is we belong to the same society and we must learn to live together. So I think the problem of social media is that it's all done without very much explicit grounding in our embodied, you know, existence, and also is very much open to manipulation. And so in that sense, I think if people are not able to critically assess social media, you know, the idea of getting information from there, right, is just illusory, because in fact you don't need social media to get the news. You can go to the news sources themselves. But when you rely on social media, you often are getting misinformation, right? And studies show, actually, especially in the United States, that the more conservative people tend to get more misinformation, and so in that sense, it, you know, you get it skewed, basically, information that tends to just help you perpetuate your views, and that's obviously not very good for politics if we're aiming for understanding each other.
Right, right. So if you are watching us right now on YouTube, stick with the rest of this episode. Come back for more episodes of Mark My Words, but then get off social media. So I think we're just about out of time today, but I do want to thank you, Professor Liu, for sitting down with me. To our viewers and listeners, do stay on social media for now, and do stay tuned to our final episode of Mark My Words Season 1, which is coming out next week. It will drop next Wednesday, and you can find it on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Or you can subscribe to the show and you'll never miss an episode, future or past. Mark My Words is a production of McGill University Advancement in collaboration with the Department of Communications and Institutional Relations. Special thanks to our producer, Frank Roop, and to my co-host, Diane Fagan, who will be back here next week for our final episode. Thank you.
Thank you.